Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 46 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go, history, where I take you on real journeys from the past that have changed the way we understand the world. In the true story I'm currently telling, we travel with 17-year-old German Georg Forster, who joined his father on an expedition of Captain James Cook aboard the HMS Resolution in the 18th century. This episode finds us anchored off Raiatea, one of the Society Islands, where Georg and the crew encounter a mysterious elite group of traveling nobles. Forster's text was written in 18th century German. I've translated it into modern English to make it easier to follow. His worldview is shaped by the Enlightenment, and from time to time I'll offer additional background and commentary to put things in perspective. What happened in the last episode? In the previous episode, the Resolution left behind the shores of Tahiti. O2, a respected chief, gave an emotional farewell, even offering to make Georg's father and Mr. Hodges honorary Errioys in Matavai, a symbolic gesture of hospitality or perhaps self-interest. A sailor attempted to escape the ship during the departure, drawn by the idyllic life in Tahiti, but was captured and punished, sparking Georg's reflections on the stark contrast between European hardship and island simplicity. In Maheine, tensions increased. Though welcomed by Ori, the aging chief, multiple thefts and even staged public ridicule of the Tahitian girl aboard highlighted the fraying respect between the locals and the Europeans. Captain Cook eventually led a show-of-force expedition inland to maintain order, which ended without violence but left a mark on both sides. The episode concluded with the arrival in Raiatea, where Georg and the crew encountered the Errioys, a traveling caste of high-born warriors and nobles with strict rules, extravagant feast, and curious customs. Their presence would become central in the next part of the journey. Wednesday, May 25th, 1774, Raiatea.
Some of the Errioys were married, just as their native companion Maheine had married Topiri. Others kept lovers. Some engaged with common prostitutes, of whom there were many on all these islands. Yet this kind of indulgence was not unusual, and in fact more widespread among so-called civilized Europeans than here. If one were to conclude from this alone that the Errioys shared their wives among themselves, it would be about as reasonable as claiming, based on the dissolute lives of certain Europeans, that in Europe there existed an entire class of people of both sexes who spent their lives in the constant pursuit of sensual pleasures. The Tahitians, however, could not be cleared of the charge of infanticide, as inexplicable as it may seem at first glance that a people so gentle, compassionate, and inclined toward friendship could also be capable of such extreme cruelty. If the inhumanity of the fathers already caused horror, what could be said of the mothers, whose hearts, everywhere else, are guided by nature and instinct to be tender, caring, and merciful? Indeed, the paths and voices of virtue are all too easily missed. Yet it remained incomprehensible how a people who had otherwise stayed so close to nature could violate its most fundamental law and harden themselves against such a deeply rooted instinct. And yet, it was bad habit that gradually dulled every feeling, until it even drowned out the voice of conscience.
The Errioys were not a random group of people, nor were they seen by their communities as criminals or outcasts. Instead, they formed a respected ritual and artistic order in the Society Islands of Polynesia. Members of this group lived lives deeply connected to performance, music, dance, and religious ceremony. They traveled from island to island, entertaining the population and taking part in political and spiritual events. Their social role was prestigious, and they were often welcomed with gifts, hospitality, and admiration wherever they went. However, belonging to this group also meant accepting a rule that may seem unthinkable today. Errioys were expected not to raise children. Their lifestyle was seen as incompatible with parenthood. Because they were constantly traveling and devoted to ritual duties, having a family was believed to disrupt the balance and identity of the order. This expectation was enforced through a cultural and religious framework rather than through individual cruelty. In their worldview, the practice was tied to sacred obligation, not personal emotion. It is important to understand that the Errioys did not represent all Tahitians or Polynesians, nor did the practice reflect the moral beliefs of the general population. Rather, this rule was limited to a small elite group whose identity depended on separation from ordinary life, including parenthood. To the wider society, it was seen as an ancient custom rather than a universal norm.
Once the Europeans had undeniable certainty that such unnatural cruelty was actually practiced among the Errioys, they confronted their young friend Maheine and questioned how he could consider it an honor to belong to such an abhorrent society. They tried to make him understand the cruelty of this behavior and left no argument unused, whether it occurred to them spontaneously or they were able to express it in his language. They succeeded in convincing him that it was wrong, and he promised that if he ever became a father, he would not kill his children and would sever all ties to the society. They were somewhat comforted to hear from him that the Errioys rarely had children. Presumably, they chose their wives and lovers from among the lowest class of licentious women, and both because of this and their excessive lustfulness, they seldom found themselves in the position of having to sacrifice an unfortunate child. After returning to England, Georg had the opportunity to speak with the Polynesian Omai about the Errioys. Georg explained how shameful it was for the entire people to tolerate a society of child murderers among them. But Omai assured him that the vast majority of the population had no part in this cruelty. The children, he said, had to be killed according to established laws, and as compensation for this bitter obligation, members of the society were granted special honors and privileges. Nevertheless, the mothers never gave their consent to the murder of their children. The men and other Errioys therefore persuaded them to give the children away. When persuasion failed, force was sometimes used. Above all, he added, these killings were carried out so secretly that not even the tautaus, the household servants, knew of them. For if it ever became known, the murderer would have to pay with his life. In this light, the Tahitians and their neighbors could no longer be reproached with more than what, unfortunately, must be said of every people. that among them are individuals wicked enough to kill their own children, and therefore even those who are quick to condemn the human heart at every opportunity could no longer triumphantly claim that there exists an entire nation capable of murder without feeling that it is wrong. How deep the corruption of morals in Europe had become could be seen, among other things, in the fact that in London there were men who publicly boasted of their skill in the art of performing abortions and openly offered their services in this field. Advertisements of this nature were distributed without shame on the streets and appeared in nearly every newspaper. For all their indulgence, the assembled Errioys did not forget their hospitality and repeatedly invited them to join their feast. But as the Europeans had only just finished their own meal, they preferred instead to take a walk, and did not return to the ship until sunset, by which time Maheine, the girl, and the other Polynesian passengers had already disembarked.
Thursday, May 26, 1774, Raiatea.
The following morning, many islanders came to visit in their canoes. The women not only boarded the ship in large numbers, but some even spent the night with the sailors. In Maheine, such visits had been noticeably less frequent. There, it was mostly unfamiliar women who had engaged in such behavior. The sailors, after only a brief pause, eagerly resumed their Tahitian way of life here, with even greater enthusiasm. That day, they took a walk to the northern end of the island, where they shot a few wild ducks and were warmly received in several places. The next day brought exceptionally pleasant weather, especially because a strong east wind made the usual heat much more bearable. They received distinguished guests on board: Oria and his family, Boba, the island's viceroy, Otaha, and Taina Mai, the beautiful dancer whom Georg had already mentioned during their last visit to the island. Boba was a tall, well-built young man, a native of Bora Bora, and related to Puni, the king of that island and conqueror of Raiatea and Taha. Maheine had often said that Puni had chosen this young man as his successor and promised him his only daughter, Maiwerua, a very beautiful girl, just 12 years old. At that time, Boba was an Errioy and kept the beautiful dancer Taina as his lover. Since she appeared to be pregnant, they spoke with her about the custom that the children of the Errioys had to be killed. The conversation, however, was short and rather fragmentary, partly because it was difficult to keep these islanders, especially the women, focused on such a topic, and partly because they still lacked the language skills to express moral or philosophical concepts properly. Their powers of persuasion were therefore quite limited, and all they managed to elicit from Taina Mai was, "Maybe your Eatua, God, in England is angry about the customs of the Errioys, but ours is not." However, she did promise, "If you come from England to take the child, I'll try to let it live, but you have to give me an axe, a shirt, and some red feathers." Yet the tone in which she said it was so playful that they could hardly hope she meant it seriously. Further discussion proved pointless. She constantly jumped from one topic to another, and they had to be content that she had even listened to them for that long. In the afternoon, they went ashore to attend a dramatic dance performance in which Poyadua, Oria's daughter, was to appear. A large crowd had gathered. These performances were highly valued here. The dancer once again showed her well-known skill and received great applause from all the Europeans. The interludes were performed by men and were of a kind entirely new to the visitors. Although they couldn't understand every word, they could tell that the names of Captain Cook and other gentlemen from their group were mentioned in the songs. The entire plot appeared to depict one of those robber tales often encountered on these islands. Another interlude portrayed the attack of the warriors from Bora Bora, with loud slaps delivered using a strap, causing a dramatic smacking sound. The third interlude was the strangest of all. It depicted a woman in labor and drew loud laughter from the audience. The role was played by a man, who mimicked all the appropriate gestures. Another large, muscular man, dressed in Tahitian cloth, played the newborn child and behaved so ridiculously that they couldn't help but laugh. The costume was so carefully chosen that even a midwife or medical expert would not have missed a single essential feature of a real newborn in this oversized boy. The native spectators especially enjoyed how the baby immediately ran around the stage so energetically after being born that the dancers could hardly catch him again. Captain Cook remarked that once they caught him, the other men pressed down his nose between the eyes. He rightly concluded that this was a real custom practiced on newborns here, as nearly all of them had flat noses.
Flattening the nose of a newborn can sound sudden or shocking to a modern listener, but for the people of Tahiti and the surrounding islands, this was not an act of violence or neglect. Instead, it was a customary practice linked to beauty and identity. In Polynesian culture, a flat, broad nose was considered attractive, dignified, and noble. It was part of the shared understanding of what a well-formed and distinguished face should look like. Many cultures throughout history have reshaped or modified the body as part of tradition. Examples include ear stretching, tattooing, dental shaping, or the molding of infant skulls in parts of South America and Europe. The Polynesian practice of gently pressing a baby's nose shortly after birth belonged to this broad category of intentional aesthetic shaping. It did not permanently harm the child and was understood as an act of care, ensuring the child would grow into the locally valued ideal of beauty. To the islanders, this small gesture connected a newborn to community standards, ancestral appearance, and cultural belonging. What may seem unusual today was completely ordinary to them, and it carried social meaning rather than cruelty.
Among all the spectators, it was the women who seemed to enjoy the performance the most. They could freely surrender to the impression of the play, since, according to local custom, nothing in it would cause them embarrassment, quite unlike European ladies, who often have to peek from behind their fans during such performances.
Friday, May 27, 1774, Raiatea.
The following morning, they took a walk southward and found very fertile land and highly hospitable people. The path led them to a large stone structure called Marae no Parua, Parua's burial ground. Georg had already mentioned that the Polynesian Tupea, who had traveled with Captain Cook on his first voyage aboard the Endeavour, bore the same name. However, Georg could not say whether this tomb had been built in his memory. Such marae were usually named after living chiefs, so it was possible that someone named Parua was still alive. At the very least, the locals living nearby assured them that the Parua to whom this tomb belonged was an Errioy. Though they were reluctant to grant that title unconditionally to Tupaia, the structure was 18 meters long and 1.5 meters wide. Its walls were made of large stones and stood about 1.8 to 2.4 meters high. They climbed over them but found nothing inside except a courtyard filled with a heap of small coral stones. Several kilometers farther on, they reached a wide bay, where 3 small islands lay within the reef. The bay was surrounded by marshland, inhabited by large numbers of wild ducks. They didn't pass up the opportunity to hunt. Afterwards, they took 2 small canoes across to one of the islands to see whether the sea had washed any shells ashore. But that hope proved empty. Apart from a single hut, clearly used only for fishing, as seen from the nets and other equipment, there were only a few coconut palms and some low brush, so they returned empty-handed, had a meal with a local who had invited them, and didn't arrive back at the ship until near sunset. During their absence, Raiatea had invited himself aboard to visit Captain Cook, and had drunk an entire bottle of wine without appearing the least bit intoxicated. As always, he had been very talkative, and had especially enjoyed discussing the lands they had visited on their journey, lands his countryman Maheine had already told him something about. After listening for a while to what the captain could tell him, he began. They may have seen much, but he could tell them about an island they probably didn't know. It lay only a few days' journey away, but was inhabited by enormous people. So tall, they stood as high as the mainmast, and as thick as the upper part of the ship's capstan. They were friendly, but if provoked, there was no chance of surviving. They could grab a person and throw him into the sea as far as one could toss a stone. If the voyagers happened to sail near that island, they should take care. These giants might wade out through the sea, lift the ship onto their shoulders, and carry it ashore. He added more absurd details, and didn't forget to give this wondrous island a name. It was called Miro Miro. The manner in which he told this tale made it obvious that it was an ironic jab at the stories of the Europeans, stories he either didn't believe or simply couldn't imagine. The satirical and clever way he embellished the narrative was truly remarkable. Bougainville had likely been right in saying that the mental liveliness of these islanders stemmed from the fertility of their land, for abundance and carefree days everywhere give rise to cheerfulness and quick minds.
Saturday, May 28, 1774, Raiatea.
During the night, several oars, boat hooks, and small anchors were stolen from the boats moored at the buoy. As soon as their absence was noticed in the morning, the captain had the chief Raiatea informed. Raiatea came immediately and picked up the captain in his own boat to search for the thieves. After rowing for about an hour, he went ashore at the southernmost part of the island and returned with all the stolen items. Meanwhile, Georg had also been ashore and had watched 2 little girls perform a haiwa, a dance not far from the bay. They were neither as richly dressed nor as skilled in their art as the dancer Poyadua. Their tamau, a hair ornament made of braided hair, was not worn in a turban-like shape, but arranged in several large curls that looked attractive and somewhat resembled the high hairstyles of fashionable ladies. In the afternoon, Poyadua danced again, and it almost seemed as though she intended to outshine her fellow performers. At the very least, she had adorned herself more lavishly than usual, draped in a great many European glass beads. Her incredible flexibility, the graceful movement of her arms, and the rapid, trembling play of her fingers were admired by the islanders just as much as opera dancers are admired in Europe. And Poyadua truly deserved that recognition, if only because she owed her skill not to a teacher, but solely to her own diligence and talent. There was only one point on which they couldn't agree with the local taste: that extreme facial expressions were considered beautiful. In Georg's opinion, they were quite the opposite, distinctly ugly and even off-putting. The frequent theatrical performances were prompted solely by the presence of the Errioys. Their presence seemed to enliven the entire island and put everyone in good spirits. They themselves set the tone. They dressed with particular splendor and appeared in new clothing almost every day. The whole day passed in pleasure and leisure. They anointed their hair with fragrant oil, sang or played the flute. One delight followed the next, and not a single joy to be had here went unclaimed. Maheine was likely the only one of his rank who wasn't quite as content as the others. The reason was that he was not shown the same marks of respect here as he had received in Tahiti. Even in the South Seas, the old saying held true: a prophet is least honored in his own country. Maheine had many relatives here, but that brought him nothing except the expectation that he should give gifts to all of them, not as a favor, but almost as an obligation. In Tahiti, on the other hand, even the smallest gift he gave was seen as an act of generosity. That way, he gained friends and benefited from it. As long as he still owned even the smallest of the rare items he had collected during the difficult and sometimes dangerous voyage aboard the Resolution, the demands never stopped. And although he gave away all his treasures bit by bit without hesitation, some of his relatives still loudly accused him of being stingy. The young man who had once been able to give to others now had to turn to his European friends again, asking them for this or that. His relatives' greed had left him with hardly more than a few red feathers, and some small items meant for his high-ranking relative Opuni, the king of Bora Bora. It was no wonder, then, that he longed to return to Tahiti. He said that as soon as he had visited Opuni and his other relatives on Bora Bora, he would return to Tahiti at once, and never leave again. Still, he would gladly have sailed to England with them if he had the slightest hope of ever returning to the South Seas. But since Captain Cook had assured him quite plainly that such a return was impossible, he preferred to give up the pleasure of seeing Europe rather than say farewell forever to his beloved homeland. And indeed, when one considered what his countryman Omai had learned among them, it was probably better for the heart and character of the unspoiled Maheine that he remained behind. He would never come to know the splendor of London, but he would also be spared the moral abysses that, in the great capitals of Europe, are nearly always the same. When the dance was over, Maheine insisted that they visit him the next day on his own land. He had often told them that he owned land on this island, and now he wanted to prove his word, especially because some among their crew had doubted it. As invited, they sailed the next morning in 2 boats to the northeastern end of the island, where his property, the district of Raiatea, was located. Errioys joined them with his family, and after 2 hours they reached their destination. Maheine received them along with 2 older brothers and led them to a spacious house. There, he immediately began preparations for a shared meal. While this was underway, Georg, his father, and Dr. Sparman went botanizing in the nearby hills. However, they did not find a single new plant. After about 2 hours, they returned. While the food was being served, Captain Cook gave a detailed account of how the meal had been prepared. 3 men had grabbed a pig weighing about 23 kilograms, laid it on its back, and suffocated it by pressing a thick stick across its neck. 1 man leaned his full body weight on each side of the animal. The 3rd held the hind legs and stuffed a bundle of grass into the anus to seal in the air. After 10 minutes, the pig was dead. Meanwhile, 2 others had lit a fire to heat the underground oven, which consisted of a pit filled with many stones. At this fire, the pig was singed so thoroughly it was as if it had been scalded in hot water. To clean it completely, they carried it to the seashore, scrubbed it with sand and gravel, and then rinsed it thoroughly. They brought the pig back to its original spot and laid it on fresh leaves to clean it inside as well. They opened the belly, removed the outer fat, and set it aside on green leaves. Then they cut out the entrails, which were immediately carried off in a basket and never seen again, though Georg was convinced they hadn't been discarded. Finally, they took out the blood and the internal fat. The blood was poured onto green leaves. The fat was added to the separated outer fat. After washing the pig again inside and out with fresh water, they placed several hot stones into its belly. These stones fell into the chest cavity, and fresh leaves were added. By then, the oven, a pit filled with heated stones, was hot enough. They removed the fire and most of the stones, leaving only the bottom layer, which served as a base onto this. They laid the pig belly down. The fat and lard, now thoroughly washed, were placed into a long trough hollowed out from a young banana trunk. A hot stone was dropped into the blood to make it clot. Small portions were wrapped in leaves, just like a large quantity of breadfruit and bananas, which were also placed in the oven. Then everything was covered with fresh leaves, followed by the remaining hot stones, another layer of leaves, and finally a layer of stones and earth. While the food was cooking underground, they prepared the table. This meant spreading out many green leaves on the floor at one end of the house. After 2 hours and 10 minutes, they opened the oven and took everything out. The guests sat around the leaves, the islanders on one side and the Europeans on the other. Where the Europeans sat, the pig was served. On the islanders' side, they placed the fat and the blood, which they alone consumed and considered especially delicious. Georg and the others, for their part, thoroughly enjoyed the meat, as it had been exceptionally well prepared, and the people in charge of the meal had shown a remarkable degree of cleanliness in everything they did. As soon as the pig was carved, the highest-ranking chiefs and Errioys fell upon it together, devouring entire handfuls at once. In general, all their table companions ate with extraordinary greed, while the poor Totos, who stood in great numbers around them, had to be content just watching. Not a single bite was left for them. Among all the onlookers, only Orea's wife and daughter received anything. Both carefully wrapped their portions in leaves to eat them later in a more secluded place. It seemed that women were allowed to eat what had been prepared and distributed by men, though at other times it appeared that certain people were not permitted to eat anything that had been touched by a specific person in the family. They could not clearly determine what rules governed these customs. Tahitians were not the only people where men and women ate separately. This practice existed among certain African nations and the inhabitants of Labrador as well. But those Africans and Inuit often showed a general disregard for the opposite sex, which might explain why they didn't wish to eat with their women. Among the Tahitians, however, where women were treated in all other respects with such kindness and decency, this peculiar separation during meals must have had some other origin. Perhaps, with more careful observation in the future, its true reason would one day be revealed. The captain had come prepared and brought along a few bottles of brandy, which, diluted with water, made the sailors' favorite drink, grog.
Grog was a very common and important part of life in the British Navy during the 18th century. Grog was a mixture of alcohol, usually rum or brandy, combined with water. At first glance, it may seem like a simple drink, but it served several key purposes on long voyages. Fresh water stored aboard ships often became unsafe to drink after months at sea. Alcohol helped sterilize it and made it drinkable for longer periods. The drink also played a role in discipline and morale. Sailors expected a daily ration of alcohol, and mixing it with water prevented heavy drunkenness while still maintaining the tradition. The recipe was eventually standardized after Admiral Edward Vernon introduced the watered mixture to prevent disorder on board. His nickname was Old Grog because of the grogram coat he wore, and the drink inherited his name. For sailors, grog was more than just a beverage. It symbolized routine, comfort, and a small form of reward during long, difficult, and often dangerous voyages. When it appears in the narrative, it signals familiarity, camaraderie, and the rhythm of life at sea.
The Errioys, and a few other distinguished islanders, found this mixture strong and nearly as pleasant as their native intoxicating kava. They drank bravely and added a few glasses of undiluted brandy on top, which pleased them so much that they soon went off in search of a quiet place to sleep it off. At 5 in the afternoon, they returned to the ship, but not before stopping for a bath, due to the intense heat, in a lovely spring they had used for this purpose several times. It lay shaded beneath fragrant bushes that protected them from the sun. The islanders, who knew all these spots well, also loved to visit the spring for its consistently cool and pleasant water. Such bathing places were quite common on these islands and undoubtedly contributed not only to good health, but also to the beauty of the landscape. Over the following days, they searched the mountains for plants and came across several previously unknown species. The mountains on this island resembled those of Tahiti, though they were somewhat lower. During one of these walks, they discovered an especially idyllic valley, densely forested and crossed by a beautiful stream that originated from high up the mountain slopes, cascading down over broken rocks in tiered waterfalls. Upon returning from this final botanical excursion, they received significant news. A local who had just come back from Maheine reported that 2 ships were anchored there. Captain Cook had the man brought into the cabin to learn more. The islander repeated his claim on deck and added that he had personally been aboard the smaller vessel, where the crew had made him drunk. They asked for the names of the captains. The man replied that the commander of the larger ship was named Taban, the other Tono. These were the same names that the islanders had previously used for Mr. Banks, and Captain Forno. Cook was greatly surprised and asked further questions. How tall were the men? The islanders said Taban was tall, Tono shorter. This too matched what they knew of those 2 men. At the same time, they had good reason to doubt the story. Had Captain Forno truly been in Maheine, he would likely have heard that Cook was nearby. Since he had originally sailed from England under Cook's command, duty would have required him to seek Cook out. That he had not done so made it likely that, If European ships were truly anchored there, they were not British. Later, upon returning to the Cape, they learned that Captain Fourneau had left Table Bay long before the reported date, and that Mr. Banks had not even departed Europe. They later found out that a French naval officer, Monsieur Saint-Denis, had been sailing in the South Pacific with 2 ships around that time. Initially, Oria confirmed the islanders' account, but then he seemed to realize that it might hasten their departure, so he later refused to comment further. He acted as though he didn't quite know what to make of the story and changed the subject whenever they brought it up. In short, a European statesman could not have evaded a delicate question more skillfully. The following day, June 3rd, large numbers of islanders came to the ship, bringing great quantities of food for sale, having heard that the Europeans were planning to sail again the next day. Though the goods were offered at very low prices, their supply of axes and knives was so depleted that the ship's armorer had to make new ones. These were crudely made and barely usable, especially the knives, whose blades were pieced together from iron barrel hoops. Still, the trusting islanders were content, as they could not yet judge quality by appearance alone. For the fact that the islanders had sometimes emptied their pockets or stolen unattended items, the Europeans now repaid them doubly by deceiving them openly. Among the people of the Society Islands, there were individuals familiar with the traditions, mythology, and astronomy of their people. Maheine had often praised them as the most learned among his people, and called them Tata o Rero, a term that could be translated roughly as teacher. After much effort to meet such a man, they finally found one in the district of Hamaneno, a chief named Tutawai, who bore the title Tata o Rero. They regretted not having met him earlier, since their departure was now imminent. Nevertheless, Georg's father made good use of their remaining time to devote himself to this important subject. Tutawai, clearly a learned man, seemed pleased to have the chance to display his knowledge. It flattered his pride to be listened to so attentively, and that, in turn, encouraged him to speak with more patience and focus than they were used to from the lively and often distractible islanders. Altogether, the religion of these island peoples appeared to be the strangest system of polytheism ever conceived. Only a few peoples are so poor or so fully absorbed in survival that they forget to think of a creator or form, even an incomplete idea of one. Such concepts seem, rather, to have been passed down through oral tradition among all nations since the time when God revealed himself directly to humankind. Through such transmission of earlier divine revelation, even in Tahiti and the other Society Islands, a spark of that belief remained, namely, the idea of a supreme being through whom all things visible and invisible were created and brought into existence. Yet history shows that as soon as any people tried to grasp the nature of this universal and incomprehensible spirit more closely, they crossed the limits that the Creator had set for our senses and understanding, and were usually led into foolish notions as a result. For this reason, limited minds soon began to imagine the attributes of the divine as separate beings, since they could form no concept of highest perfection. And so, a vast number of gods and goddesses came into being. One error gave rise to the next, and because every human being has the impulse to form an image of God, the Father passed on his understanding to his children. As the population grew, distinct social classes began to form. These differences made it easier for some to access sensual pleasures, while others were excluded. If among those excluded there was a particularly clever individual who recognized the human need for reverence toward a higher being, he often, perhaps always, used this insight for his own purposes. To achieve his aim, the deceiver sought to control the minds of the masses and make them submissive. The divine images he introduced had to serve his intentions. That is why he replaced the original, childlike love for a benevolent God with fear and dread of divine wrath. This seemed to be exactly what had happened in the Society Islands. There, they worshipped gods with a wide variety of attributes. Particularly striking was the fact that each island had its own version of the story of the gods. This became clearly apparent when comparing those accounts to the ones recorded during Cook's first voyage. Tutawai began by explaining that the supreme god or creator of heaven and earth had a different name on each island, or more precisely, that each island's people believed in a different supreme being to whom they gave precedence over all other gods. On Tahiti and Eimeo, the highest god was called O Ruahatu in Maheine. They named him Tane. On Raiatea, he was Oru. In Otaha, he was called Ora. The people of Bora Bora called him Tautu. On Marua, he was Otu. And on Tabuamanu, known to Europeans as Sir Charles Saunders Island, he was named Taroe. The sea, they believed, was governed by 13 deities: Uruhadu, Tamayui, Ta'api, Otuarionu, Tanyea, Tahu Meona, Otamaue, Owai, Owata, Tahua, Tiutea, Omahuru, and Owadu. Despite this multitude of sea gods, they still believed in a creator of the sea, another god named U-Mareo. They thought of the sun in much the same way. It was said to have been created by O-Maue, a powerful god who was also responsible for earthquakes. But the sun was inhabited and ruled by another deity called Tutumo Sovoriri. This god was believed to have a beautiful human form with hair flowing all the way down to the feet. According to their beliefs, the dead would go to this being, live there, and eat breadfruit and pork, but raw, not cooked. They also believed that each person carried within them an inner being. This being acted on sensory impressions and assembled thoughts from individual perceptions. Thoughts were called parau no te obu, which literally meant words in the belly.
That brings us to the end of episode 46 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations from this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.